Imagine a time when survival wasn't a choice, it was a daily battle. Before pyramids, before written words, there were men. Not just any men-rugged, thick-browed Neanderthals carving their fate into the frozen earth of Ice Age Siberia. They didn't have cities or kings. What they had were stone tools, sharp instincts, and each other. At Chagyrskaya Cave, they braved bitter winds and hunted beasts 3 times their size. Their story isn't one of cavemen grunting in ignorance. It's a tale of grit, resilience, and adaptation that spans continents. These weren't mindless brutes. They were survivors, craftsmen, explorers of the Paleolithic frontier. At Prehistoric Shadows, we dig into the bones of history to uncover the truth beneath the stereotype. And before we go deeper, tell us in the comments, what comes to your mind when you hear the word Neanderthals? Just type Neanderthals and join the circle around the ancient fire. Tucked beneath the stark Alai Mountains, along the lonely banks of the Cherish River in southwestern Siberia, lies Chagyrskaya Neanderthals, cold limestone enclave weathered by time and wind. To the casual observer, it may seem like just another rocky cleft in a remote corner of the world. But peel back the layers of silt and sediment, and you'll find echoes of a life lived fiercely. Between 59,000 and 49,000 years ago, this cave was not silent. It breathed. It glowed with firelight, rang with the rhythm of stone against flint, and pulsed with the heartbeat of a people locked in an intimate relationship with the land. Here, Neanderthals did not merely survive, they endured. They hunted in bitter, cold, crafted tools from raw stone, and gathered around hearths that cast flickering shadows across ancient walls. This was no accidental shelter, it was a deliberate choice. A stronghold positioned at the edge of the known world, where winter ruled and the terrain offered more danger than comfort. Yet the Chagyrskaya Neanderthals made it home. The site today is windswept and desolate, but within its stratified layers lie over 90 fossil fragments, jaws, teeth, bone siege, a fragment of a forgotten story. And alongside them, more than 90,000 stone artifacts, silent witnesses to a daily grind of craftsmanship, hunting, and survival under unforgiving skies. In this cave, we don't just find bones. We find presence. We find the imprint of strategy, of familial bonds, of a people who stood their ground on the icy edge of existence. This wasn't the domain of wanderers, it was the domain of planners, of those who read the land like a map and left their mark in flint. Chagyrskaya is not just a place, it's a portal. A reminder that our ancient cousins once carved out a life here not in warmth and ease, but in hardship, unity, and stubborn will. This is midnight at the edge of the world, and it was theirs. What if the story of Siberian Neanderthals isn't one of isolation, but of bold migration? Chagyrskaya's Neanderthals weren't homegrown survivors who evolved quietly in the cold. They were travelers, strangers in a strange land who had set out from the western fringes of Eurasia, crossing thousands of kilometers into the heart of the Ice Age East. They came not from the north, nor from nearby Denisovan populations, but from Europe. Genetic and cultural traces suggest an astonishing trek. From the Crimean Peninsula, through the dense forests and cold plains of Central Europe, and onward into the subarctic wilds of Siberia, not in caravans or conquest, but in tight-knit hunting bands. And what they carried with them was more than muscle and willpower. They carried memory of tool-making traditions, hunting strategies, and communal bonds. Every flint biface, every stone scraper unearthed in Chagyrskaya is a signature of their Western heritage. They didn't adapt in place, they transplanted an entire way of life across a continent. Let that sink in. Nearly 3,000 kilometers of open terrain, predators, shifting climates, and unfamiliar landscapes. No maps, no trails, only instinct, kinship, and the hard-earned knowledge passed from fire circle to fire circle. What drove them? Scarcity? Herd migrations? Something deeper in inherited restlessness, a pattern of movement coded into their very being? This wasn't aimless drift. It was calculated persistence. To look at Chagyrskaya is to see the eastern frontier of a Western tradition, cultural echo cast across the steppes. And it forces us to rethink what kind of species Neanderthals really were. Not frozen in place, but capable of crossing Eurasia with purpose. They weren't simply primitive relics of local survival. They were agents of expansion, carriers of memory, and authors of a tale that stretches from the limestone caves of Europe to the icy edge of Siberia, a Western story etched in Eastern ice. Beneath the frozen soil of Chagyrskaya Cave lies one of the richest archaeological caches ever uncovered from the Neanderthal world. Not just a few scattered fragments, but a structured archive of life. Over 90 fossil remains from Neanderthal men, women, and children. And alongside them, an astonishing 90,000-plus stone artifacts, each shaped by hand, each bearing the marks of intention, repetition, and craft. This isn't a graveyard. It's a living site frozen in time. A place where bones and blades whisper of lives once lived with urgency and skill. Teeth worn flat from years of chewing sinew. Jawbones thickened from biting down on hides, sinews, or tools. Fragments of skulls showing the robust structure needed to survive a harsh, wind-lashed climate. This is not theory. It's evidence. Tangible, unflinching. Stone tools, some crude. Some masterfully honed, litter the floor layers, like the residue of 1,000 mornings. Here, flint was chipped, reshaped, perfected. These weren't people fumbling in darkness. They were methodical, deliberate. Generations trained their hands to shape what nature gave them into what survival demanded. Their tools tell a story of routine and resilience. They tell us what animals were hunted, how the hides were scraped, how the blades were retouched. Some tools were discarded, unfinished, abandoned mid-task, maybe as hunters rushed out after prey or storm clouds rolled in. Others were reused, reshaped, reforged, just like the people who wielded them. Every artifact is a decision frozen in stone. Every fossil, a reminder of flesh once warm, hands once calloused, eyes once scanning the icy plains beyond the cave mouth. To stand before these remains is to feel time contract. To realize you were staring not at bones, but at people. People with knowledge, muscle, instinct, and stories we are only just beginning to translate. Stones, bones, stories, all still echoing from the shadows of Chagyrskaya. To understand the Neanderthals of Chagyrskaya, you must first understand the world they were born into. This wasn't just a cold season. It was a glacial chapter, a merciless stretch of prehistory when the Earth tightened its grip and the climate pushed all life to its limits. Glaciers pressed down from the north like silent walls of ice. Forests that once offered cover, game, and firewood withdrew, replaced by open, windswept steppes. The land cracked beneath the freeze. The air was dry, oxygen thin and biting. Yet amid this shifting, hostile terrain, Neanderthals did not retreat. They adapted. They settled at the margins of ice and endurance, carving out an existence where few species could persist. And they did it without permanent shelters or agriculture. They did it with what they carried in their hands and heads: Hearths were dug deep into cave floors, firelight flickering against limestone walls. Each flame a defiance of the cold. Their bodies shorter, thicker-limbed followed nature's unspoken rules for heat conservation. Broad noses warmed the air before it hit their lungs. Dense musculature preserved energy for long hunts on an empty stomach. Their tool stow, reworked, repurposed, spoke of a mindset hardened by scarcity. This was not a climate for the weak. This was the crucible in which human resilience was forged. Survival here wasn't luck. It was engineering, strategy, memory. Even today, when archaeologists brush snow from Chagyrskaya's cave floor, they uncover the marks of stone tools still sharp, hearths still visible, bones still fractured from marrow extraction. Signs of life not clinging, but persisting. These Neanderthals weren't clumsy holdouts of a fading world. They were ice-tested tacticians, fine-tuned to a climate that punished hesitation. Their story reminds us that human success didn't begin with comfort, it began with resistance. To cold, to hunger, to extinction. Between the glaciers, they built their world one fire, one hunt, one winter at a time. And somehow, they made it work. Among the most compelling clues left behind by the Chagyrskaya, Neanderthals are not their bones, but their tools. Thousands of them, not scattered randomly, but arranged in structured layers, shaped with deliberate hands. And, when we examine their form, a clear lineage emerges. These tools belong to a tradition. Not a local improvisation, but a legacy carried across continents. They are unmistakably Micoquian. This stone tool tradition, born in Western and Central Europe, is marked by asymmetrical bifaces, keel-shaped scrapers, and the distinctive keel macera heavy, multifunctional blade that could be resharpened again and again. These aren't crude flakes or haphazard implements. They are purpose-built, durable, and complex. Each tells a story not only of what was hunted, but how. Of how stone was read, shaped, refined, passed from master to apprentice over generations. And here's where it gets fascinating. The Micoquian tools found at Chagyrskaya are virtually identical to those recovered in Germany, Poland, and the Carpathians, separated by thousands of kilometers, yet culturally connected. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by chance. It means that the Chagyrskaya Neanderthals weren't just adapting, they were preserving. They brought this tool-making heritage with them as they migrated east, honoring it in the sub-zero wilds of Siberia. These artifacts are more than functional. They are symbols of continuity, evidence that ideas, not just people, were moving across the Paleolithic world. They reflect something deeply human, the urge to carry knowledge forward, even when the landscape shifts and the temperature drops. The Micoquian toolkit was their passport, their survival kit, their cultural identity etched in stone. In a world without maps or language as we know it, these tools were the language of silent tradition passed hand to hand, generation to generation. Across grasslands, forests, and snowfields, this heritage endured. And in the frozen earth of Chagyrskaya, it speaks again. What happens when two sciences, genetics and archaeology, tell the same story? You listen. And what they say about the Neanderthals of Chagyrskaya is nothing short of remarkable. These people weren't native to the harsh Siberian frontier. They weren't a slow-breeding, cold-adapted group who evolved locally in isolation. They were migrants. Their bloodlines, their tools, and their cultural signatures all point west back to Central Europe, the Carpathian Basin, perhaps even Crimea. The evidence isn't speculative. It's layered. It's in the fossils' genomes pulled from teeth and bones that match closely with Neanderthal individuals found over 3,000 kilometers away in places like Vindiža Cave, Croatia. It's in the tools Micoquian in form, function, and craftsmanship, without a hint of Siberian deviation or local innovation. And that's the key. If this population had lingered in Siberia for millennia, we'd expect their toolkits to evolve scrapers, adapted for different hides, bifaces refined for local game, or blades shaped to fit new prey. But they didn't. They brought Western traditions intact, like a family heirloom passed from one generation to the next, untouched by the new world around them. It's as if they carried not just their DNA, but a cultural blueprint. And they followed it faithfully, even at the edge of survival. That kind of fidelity to tradition suggests more than practicality. It suggests identity. A shared way of life strong enough to endure migration, adaptation, and the relentless bite of the Siberian cold. Archaeology uncovers the stones. Genetics uncovers the blood. And together, they draw a picture of a people in motion anchored by memory, not geography. The Chagyrskaya Neanderthals didn't evolve where they lived. They brought their roots with them and planted them in frozen soil. And in doing so, they remind us that cultural continuity can be as enduring as any bloodline. That to migrate is not to forget but to remember harder. In prehistory, stories weren't written, they were buried. And in the case of the Chagyrskaya Neanderthals, the most enduring record isn't ink or stone, it's DNA. Extracted from teeth and bone fragments deep within Chagyrskaya Cave, ancient genetic sequences have painted a surprisingly vivid picture. And it points unmistakably west. These Neanderthals are not closely related to the older populations from the nearby Denisovan cave, despite their geographic proximity. Instead, their closest genetic relatives are thousands of kilometers away in Vindiža Cave, Croatia. It's not a guess. It's hard data cross-validated across multiple individuals, using advanced paleogenomic techniques that compare single nucleotide variations across ancient genomes. These aren't minor affinities. They are familial echoes suggesting the Chagyrskaya group may have descended from the very same Western Neanderthal population that once roamed the limestone corridors of Central Europe. This creates a striking paradox. Two caves, Denisova and Chagyrskaya, than 100 kilometers apart, yet their Neanderthal inhabitants are genetically distinct. One group absorbed genes from Denisovans, the mysterious sister species to both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The other, at Chagyrskaya, shows no such mixture. Their genome is clean of Denisovan traces, rich with Western European markers. What does that mean? It means we're not looking at one unified Neanderthal world, but multiple migration waves, each with its own origin, culture, and fate. It means the Neanderthal story is not a slow fade in a single direction, but a complex web of movement, mixing, and isolation. The DNA tells us these were Europeans in exile, carrying their bloodlines eastward into the Siberian frost, maintaining genetic continuity even as glaciers crept southward and herds moved like clockwork across the plains. To know them is to know that Neanderthals were never static. They were dynamic. Their footprints stretched across continents, and their DNA, trapped in the marrow of old bones, still speaks softly but with startling clarity. It whispers of cold nights in unknown lands, and kin long departed. The Chagyrskaya Neanderthals left behind more than tools and bones. They left behind their genetic footprint, and in that ancient coda retrieved from teeth, skull fragments, and long-buried marrows, a revelation about their world. Their genome shows extremely low genetic diversity, not in the way we see in modern isolated tribes, but to a degree that signals something deeper. A population bottleneck, a sharp contraction. It suggests they descended from a very small founding group, perhaps just a few extended families who ventured eastward across the Eurasian landmass into the unforgiving cold of Siberia. Imagine that. A tiny band of men, women, and children separated from their western kin by mountains, ice, and time. Alone at the edge of the world. What does that look like? It looks like shared fires in narrow caves. It looks like grandparents teaching grandchildren to napstone the same way their ancestors had done 3,000 kilometers west. It looks like tight-knit clans, bound not only by blood, but by necessity. Survival in glacial Siberia wasn't a solo endeavor, it was a collective act. Each person mattered. The hunter, the child, the elder who remembered the way her father shaped scrapers decades earlier. In a world stripped to its bare bones, connection was currency. There were no outsiders. There was no luxury of division. What held them together was more than instinct, it was brotherhood. The genome doesn't just show genetic closeness. It reflects social closeness, a population that bred within a small circle because no other option existed, and perhaps because trust was everything. When your life depends on who watches your back on the hunt, or who keeps the fire burning through a snowstorm, you cling tighter to those you know. That's what the genes reveal. Not just isolation, but interdependence. Not just a bottleneck in numbers, but a crucible in culture. And it's here, in this fragile intimacy, that the Neanderthals of Chagyrskaya may have found their greatest strength. In a world collapsing into ice, they found warmth in each other. In paleoanthropology, proximity doesn't always mean connection. Nowhere is that clearer than in the cold stone corridors of Siberia, where two Neanderthal populations lived close enough to hear the same wolves howl at night, yet remained genetically distinct. At first glance, it seems improbable. The Chagyrskaya Neanderthals occupied a cave just a short distance from the now famous Denisovan cave, home to an enigmatic sister lineage known as the Denisovan sand, to Neanderthals who had clearly interbred with them. But here's the twist. Chagyrskaya Neanderthals show no signs of Denisovan admixture. None. Not a trace in the DNA. Their genome, sequenced with cutting-edge paleogenomic techniques, reveals a clean Western Neanderthal lineage close to Vindasia Cave in Croatia, not to the Denisovan-touched groups that live just over the ridge. It's like two caravans passing in the night, bound by the same harsh climate, but driven by different histories. This isn't just a quirk of chance, it tells us something profound. The Neanderthals at Chagyrskaya were not locals. They were migrants from the West, part of a distinct wave of expansion that swept across Eurasia independently of the Denisovan interactions unfolding nearby. And they brought their culture, genes, and traditions with them intact. No blending. No convergence. Two human groups, separated not by geography, but by time and migration history. This genetic firewall suggests more than physical distance. It implies limited contact, perhaps even mutual avoidance, between the Western Neanderthal newcomers and the long-established Denisovan populations or their hybridized kin. Why? We may never know. Perhaps differences in language, behavior, or ecological niche kept them apart. Or perhaps the waves of migration simply didn't overlap long enough to mix. What we do know is this: Neanderthal history was not a single thread. It was a tapestry woven from multiple journeys with separate origins and sometimes separate destinies. And Chagyrskaya stands as evidence that even in the Ice Age, the story of who we are was already being written in parallel. In the end, it's the bones that speak, not through words, but through shape, stress, and wear quiet testaments to lives lived in motion, in hardship, and in deep connection with the land. The Chagyrskaya Neanderthals left behind a skeletal record that tells us more than any artifact ever could. They weren't just survivors, they were engineered by nature for survival in one of the harshest climates the planet has ever known. Thick, dense bones, broad shoulders, wide hips, heavy enamel on their teeth, resistant to fracture even under decades of chewing sinew and cracking marrow. Their skulls, with pronounced brow ridges and low, elongated crania, weren't brutish, they were optimized. Optimized for endurance, for resisting the cold, for powering through the physical demands of a hunter's life. Their limbs tell a particularly compelling story. Shorter femurs, wider rib cages, compact torsos, all conforming to Bergman's and Allen's rules evolutionary principles that explain how warm-blooded mammals adapt to cold environments by developing stockier frames to conserve body heat. These Neanderthals weren't tall or lean like later Homo sapiens. They were built low and strong like stone walls against a glacial wind. But the wear on their bones adds another layer of detail. Grooves in finger joints, stress markers on knees, and microfractures along their shoulders suggest a life of repetition and resilience. They knapped stone daily. They threw spears. They hauled carcasses across frozen plains. They squatted around fires, tanned hides, and taught their young to wield flint and fire with precision. Their bones even bear arthritic changes, not from age, but from use. These weren't idle beings. They were active, collaborative, and perpetually in motion. And that matters, because it paints a picture far from the stereotype of the slow, solitary caveman. These were people with memory, with knowledge passed from elder to youth, with bodies shaped not just by nature, but by purpose. In their remains, we find more than anatomy. We find a story of determination, written in calcium and marrow. A reminder that even 50,000 years ago, to be human Neanderthal or not meant to build, endure, and belong. The Neanderthals of Chagyrskaya were not static relics frozen in time. They were part of a broader, dynamic human drama that unfolded across continents and centuries. Their bones, their tools, and their genetic code bear witness to a story far richer than mere survival. They were migrants, but not wanderers. Their eastward journey from Central Europe into the frozen frontier of southwestern Siberia was not random was purposeful. A migration driven not only by climate and prey, but by the enduring threads of community, memory, and technological mastery. They didn't simply reach Siberia. They thrived there. In a world marked by glacial cold, limited daylight, and unpredictable food sources, the Chagyrskaya Neanderthals managed to reproduce, adapt, and maintain cultural continuity over generations. That is not just resilience, it is strategy. They followed the great seasonal herds, bison, reindeer, mammoths. They knew the rhythm of the land, the routes, the winds, the ice. And they brought more than bodies. They carried ideas. Their Micoquian toolkit, unaltered across vast distances, reflects not desperation but discipline. Their burial practices, hearth arrangements, and site reoccupations suggest a deep understanding of placea recognition that even in hostile environments, home could be made. What's extraordinary is that this group left virtually no trace of interbreeding with local Denisovans, despite being in proximity. They were a cultural island, carrying their European identity with pride and precision across the snow-swept steppes. That's not just biology. That's legacy. In this sense, Chagyrskaya is more than an archaeological site. It is a monument to human mobility and cultural tenacity. A signal fire in the deep past, illuminating the fact that Neanderthals were not the slow, doomed cousins of Homo sapiens but strategic, mobile, and capable of adapting to extremes we can barely imagine today. Their story challenges us to rethink what survival means, not just enduring, but persisting with purpose. And perhaps that is their greatest gift. Not just fossils, not just tools, but a legacy of movement, meaning, and memory carved into the cold heart of Siberia. At Prehistoric Shadows, we don't see Neanderthals as primitive footnotes in a human-centered story. We see them as protagonists in their own right. The discoveries at Chagyrskaya remind us that Neanderthals were not static cave dwellers clinging to the last light of their species. They were dynamic travelers, artisans of stone, and survivors with deep cultural roots that spanned continents. Their movements were not blind wanderings, they were strategic migrations, carved across Europe and into the edge of Siberia with intent, memory, and adaptation. Each tool unearthed, each genome sequenced, pushes back against the old myth of Neanderthal imitation. Instead, we witness resilience over millennia, cultures that evolved, persisted, and left their mark in places once thought unreachable. If the endurance of these ancient cousins sparks something in you, whether it's curiosity, respect, or awe, we invite you to stay with us. Click subscribe and journey deeper into the bones, the fire, and the spirit of prehistoric life. Because at Prehistoric Shadows, every episode is a window into a forgotten chapter of humanity's larger story. And every comment, every question, every aha moment brings that story closer to life. We believe that understanding Neanderthals is not just about the past, it's about expanding what it means to be human. The Neanderthals of Chagyrskaya, with their unbroken tool traditions and genetic lineages, stood shoulder to shoulder with early Homo sapiens in complexity and capability. They didn't simply fade into the background, they shaped Eurasia, left echoes in our DNA, and lit fires that still burn beneath the surface of modern life. Stay curious, and never underestimate the shadows. They often hold the truest forms of light.